Let's talk about the tropics. Let's talk about hurricane season. Today, we're going to talk about frequently asked questions about hurricane season. Maybe some things you know, some things you don't know, maybe some things you've always wondered. Why is this? Why is that? Well, we're going to get to that on today's program here on Mondays with Mike. I'm Mike Iskovitz. I'm the Chief Meteorologist at Fox 26 here in Houston, Texas. I want to start out, though, with a couple of interesting things that are happening in the tropics. Luckily, nothing that's a threat at all to the United States. But I wanted to show you this, which is this swirl, really cool looking swirl in the central Atlantic Ocean. Now, each day, NOAA can take a sector of their geostationary models, which we call GOES satellites. And instead of just looking at like the full disk, which has a resolution of 4 kilometers, which is a little blocky, or the United States, which has a resolution of 2 kilometers, we can get 1 kilometer resolution here on these smaller sectors that are called mesosectors. And so today we get one on this disturbance in the central Atlantic Ocean. This is one that could be upgraded depending on when you're watching this. It may have already been upgraded, but it does show potential that it's going to get upgraded by the National Hurricane Center to either a tropical depression or maybe what they call a subtropical depression because it's a little farther to the north than tropical systems usually form. But this is cool, isn't it? I mean, when I looked at this, I just said, wow, you could definitely see a low-level circulation. And by that, I mean, we could take a look here and see these are cumulus clouds that are just wrapping around the bottom side of what's very clearly a circulation. Now, obviously, this is not an eye. It's not a powerful storm, but it is pretty cool to look at here. And where you see these billowy areas that look like cauliflower on the north side of the circulation, that's the convection. So those are the really tall cumulonimbus clouds and all of that. So that's where all of the precipitation is falling. And then the bottom side is dry. I'm sure getting windy. The National Hurricane Center estimates the wind speeds are about 35 miles per hour, but it could get upgraded. So just wanted to let you know where this is located. It is very far from the United States. I mean, we're talking about thousands of miles away. It's actually not this swirl here. It's embedded within this area. And this is in the middle of Nowhereville out there. So not a concern to any land areas, not even a concern to Bermuda. What is a little tricky with this one, though, is whether or not, if it does get upgraded, does it have all the characteristics of what would be called a warm weather system or a warm core low to be called a tropical depression or maybe even tropical storm Andrea? Or does it look a little bit more like a mid-latitude system where it has aspects of both and could be called subtropical storm Andrea? Don't know yet. We'll see what the National Hurricane Center has to say about it, and we'll see how it develops here over the next couple of days. That being said, you know, it's really neat to check these things out when they're far away and you don't have to worry about them. It's being pushed away from the United States by this big area of high pressure that is a heat dome that's producing extreme heat across the Midwest and the East Coast of the United States. I mean, we're talking about high temperatures that could reach 100 degrees in places like Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, and maybe middle and upper 90s for New York City. Could even be in the upper 90s for places like Detroit and Chicago. So that is dangerous heat, especially when you factor in the humidity and you end up with heat index values like 105 to 110. That's just something that's not common in those areas. And a lot of those northern cities, people don't have air conditioning, or if they do, maybe it's just in one room, you know, kind of thing. So, you know, it can be a bit on the dangerous side. But anyway, that's what's directing this storm away from us, so we don't have to worry about that. We can check out here the exclusive Fox weather model and take a 5-day view of what's going to be happening in the tropics here, taking us through Wednesday, and here is Thursday, Friday, and heading into the weekend. Now, what you notice here is that there's another low that could be developing over here south of Acapulco. Remember, they just got hit by Hurricane Eric, which hit as a Category 3. It set records as the earliest Category 3 to hit Mexico, and also the farthest east, meaning it was over here in this area when it strengthened to hurricane status. So, but I guess the bottom line is that I want you to know, for folks that are watching us from the good old USA and here in Houston, is that there's nothing immediate that is headed our way. Does it feel like this hurricane season maybe is off to a little bit of a quiet start? Well, it is. In the Atlantic Basin, which includes the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of America, or the Gulf of Mexico, either way, normally we would have our first storm forming approximately June 20th. Some years it's earlier, some years it's later, but that's the average first date. 8 out of the last 30 years, a storm did not form until July or August. So this would make, 9 out of the last 31 years. It's not extremely unusual. And this is the first time since 2014 that we haven't had a storm form to this date. Well, let me put it this way. The last time that we didn't get a named storm until July was in 2014. I don't know if this one in the Atlantic will get upgraded. If it does, then obviously this doesn't apply anymore. So that's the latest on the tropics. Now, speaking of the tropics, I have some frequently asked questions, or FAQs, that we're going to take a look at so I can answer them for you and kind of get you ready for the upcoming season that is just now getting started.
All right, so now let's take a look at frequently asked questions. Some of these are a little basic, but I think even the basic ones you might learn a little bit about as we head into now week 4 of hurricane season, and the more active part, of course, coming our way very soon. So the first frequently asked question is pretty basic. When is hurricane season, and why is hurricane season defined as these dates? Well, hurricane season in the Atlantic runs from June 1st until November the 30th. Why choose those dates? Well, did you know 97% of all tropical storms, named systems, form between June 1st and November 30th. So it basically encompasses almost all storms that form. There has been a phenomenon lately, though, where we get preseason storms, mostly forming in the month of May, and those are increasingly catching the attention of the National Hurricane Center and the WMO, or the World Meteorological Organization. And it may be that someday, if this trend continues, that hurricane season is pushed back, or moved up, I suppose I should say, to May. The Eastern Pacific Basin, which is that one down there by the Pacific coast of Mexico, their hurricane season begins on May 15th because they tend to see storms a little earlier. All right, this one comes up all the time because we use terminology sometimes and probably need to make sure that everybody knows what we're talking about. What is the difference between a tropical disturbance, a tropical depression, a tropical storm, and a hurricane? All right, so here you go. Tropical disturbance just means a general area of thunderstorms that's occurring in the tropics. It sometimes is associated with a tropical wave or a weak area of low pressure, but it's completely disorganized. Now, the next step up from that is a tropical depression. Now, tropical depression is a closed circulation. So you have an area of low pressure, you have air that is making like a complete round trip, I suppose, around that low. And if the winds are less than 40 miles per hour, then it would be a tropical depression. And at that point, it gets a number. So TD number 1, TD number 7, what have you. After that, if it continues to strengthen, then you have tropical storm. Now, tropical storm technically is 39 miles per hour or faster. But let's just remember, these numbers are always rounded to the nearest 5, always. So the Hurricane Center is not going to come back and say, this storm has 72 mile per hour winds. It just doesn't work. It'll either be rounded down to 70 or up to 75. So let's say between 40 miles per hour and 70 miles per hour, closed circulation in the tropics, that's going to be a tropical storm. Once the winds get 75 miles per hour, it becomes a hurricane. All right. Once it becomes a tropical storm or a hurricane, it gets a name, okay? And for example, the first name this year is Andrea. How are hurricanes named? Well, there's a list that repeats every 6 years, and all of the names are reused in alphabetical order, and they go girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, unless the storm causes major damage or major fatalities and casualties, in which case the storm name will be retired and it won't ever be used again. And there are a lot of very well-known retired names like Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Ike or Hurricane Andrew or Hurricane Hugo. You know, a good list goes on of storms that name is never going to be used again. Where does the list come from? It actually comes from, believe it or not, the United Nations. There's a branch of the UN there called the World Meteorological Organization, and it's for all of the meteorology bureaus from the United States, from Canada, from the United Kingdom, from Europe, from Japan, from China, from India, from Africa, all of the South America, all the groups get together to share knowledge about the atmosphere, to share like sometimes satellite imagery. Like for example, the United States has big giant satellites that see almost the whole world, but on the other side of the world we get imagery from Japan. So anyway, so that goes through the World Meteorological Organization, and they come up with the list of names. Now, there are some letters that are not used. Say Q is not used, X is not used. I kind of think they could get creative and come up with a Q and an X and a Y and a Z, but they choose not to. So the last name is W. What if we run out of names? Well, there are 21 letters that are used. If we run out of names, there's now a supplemental list, another list of A through Z names that would be used. So you would start at A again. Remember though, it wasn't that long ago that we had to go to that Greek alphabet. Remember that one year where we had tropical storm Alpha, and then we had Beta and we had Gamma. That's not going to happen anymore. It was too confusing. So what are the different hurricane categories? We talk about Category 1, Category 2, all the way up to Category 5. Well, what do they mean? It's part of what is called the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. This was developed in the 1970s by Herbert Saffir, who was an engineer. This was in Florida, I believe. And Dr. Robert Simpson was the director of the National Hurricane Center. Well, Saffir was, like I said, an engineer, and he came up with what is called a damage potential scale. And that's what the Saffir-Simpson scale is. It doesn't predict rainfall. It doesn't predict how fast the storm is moving. It doesn't predict the impact of tornadoes. It doesn't predict the impact of storm surge, which is that rise in water. It's only giving you an estimate of the type of damage that could be done based on the wind speed. And so this is done by going in and measuring storms. Like, we know that this storm had 90-mile-per-hour winds. What kind of damage did it cause? We know that this one had 150. What kind of damage did it cause? So based on that, there are 5 categories. So Category 1 has maximum sustained winds between 75 and 95 miles per hour. Between 96 and 110, you have Cat 2. Between 111 and 129, you have a Cat 3. From 130 to 156, you have a Cat 4. And then 157 and higher, you have a Cat 5. Now, as I mentioned, all those are going to be rounded. So basically 160 and higher is going to be a Cat 5. Why do hurricanes form where they do? Why don't hurricanes form, in Canada? Why do they form over the warm ocean? It's really neat and it's really complicated, but it has to do with the fact that you have energy that's stored in the upper part of the ocean, and that energy is heat, right? So the water evaporates. We've probably all learned about the water cycle in school, evaporation and condensation and precipitation, and it kind of goes over and over again. Well, it's more complicated than that, because when the evaporated air rises, it condenses. So it cools down and it condenses onto little microscopic particles, actually, like dust, or could be sea salt. There's a lot of things. They're called cloud condensation nuclei. But when the water vapor, which is a gas, changes into a water drop, there's actually a release of heat, and that is called latent heat, or the latent heat of condensation. So when it changes phase from a gas to a liquid, it releases heat, and that's what fuels the hurricane. So yes, the warm water does fuel the hurricane, and generally you need water temperatures of at least 80 degrees for a tropical system to form. The warmer, typically the worse, right? But it's that phase change that happens, the gas changing to a liquid that really fuels these hurricanes. Now, of course, that happens in regular thunderstorms too, but on the scale of hurricanes and maintaining this type of really large circulation for days and days and days and days, that's kind of what fuels these things. All right, so now we're getting into some important terms to remember if you're going to be threatened by a hurricane. This one is, what is the difference between a hurricane watch and a hurricane warning? Very important, right? Well, a hurricane watch typically means that hurricane conditions are possible in the watch area within 48 hours. So that's been expanded actually. It used to only be 36 hours. Now it goes out 48 hours. Now a warning is issued when hurricane conditions are expected within 36 hours. So if a warning is issued for your area, and they'll be issued, by the way, they used to only be issued along the coastline, and that became a little confusing because people inland, even if you're 10 miles inland, you might think, well, I don't live on the coast, so I'm not under a warning. Well, now, through the years, that changed from hurricane warning, then they added a hurricane inland wind warning. Now that hurricane warning is going to cover all areas that could be impacted by hurricane conditions. So that's very important. So if a hurricane warning is in effect for your area, you can expect winds of at least 75 miles per hour, heavy rain, the chance for storm surge if you're along the coastline. All right, what other threats are there besides wind? Obviously, rain is the first one that comes to mind, right? So rain, that results in one of the prime threats that's called inland flooding. We also have storm surge flooding. Storm surge is when the water gets pushed to a much higher level than normal tide levels would be. So you just imagine, the easiest way to think about it is you're like pushing the water at 100 miles an hour over a long distance, and it just piles up water along the coastline where eventually it will rise and you'll end up with 5 feet or 8 feet or even up to 12 feet or more of a rise in sea level. Think of it in a way as a tsunami. It is different, but think about that sort of thing where this surge comes in and just destroys everything in its path. So you have the rain causing inland flooding, you have storm surge, you have the wind obviously, and then you have tornadoes. This is one thing that probably most often gets overlooked with landfalling tropical systems, whether it's a tropical storm or a tropical storm or a hurricane. Tornadoes are very common, and they happen to form in what's called the front right quadrant of the storm. So if a storm is making landfall, kind of look on the most of the time like the north and east side of it, and you'll find the highest likelihood for tornadoes. In the case of Hurricane Beryl, which hit here about 1 year ago in the Houston area, Category 1, it brought us a lot of really high winds, but it brought an outbreak of tornadoes from the southeastern United States northward. So that was a big deal. Do slow-moving hurricanes cause more damage? Maybe. Yes and no. Why do I say that? Well, because every storm is different, might be a different size, different speed, all of that stuff. But I will say one thing. Now, this is a good rule of thumb to think about. Rainfall. Slower moving storms tend to produce more rainfall. And there's a really interesting and useful rule of thumb. In general, if you take the speed that the storm is moving, not the speed of the winds, but the storm motion, divide it into 100, and that will give you the approximate amount of rain that you can expect. So, keeping it simple, if the storm is moving 10 miles per hour and you divide that into 100, you get 10. 10 inches of rain is an approximation of what to expect. By the same measure, if the storm is moving slower, like the question asked, let's say it's moving at 5 miles per hour. Well, 5 divided into 100 is 20. So that gives you the potential for 20 inches of rain. So yes, slow-moving storms do present their own risks, certainly, that come with it. All right, I want to talk about evacuations. If you live near the coastline, there's a good chance that if if there's a big storm coming, you may be asked to evacuate. And so frequently asked questions there. How do I know if I need to evacuate, right? How do I know if I need to evacuate? Well, each jurisdiction, each state will do it a little differently. I want to tell you how it's done in Texas because it is similar in many other spots. Our evacuation zones are broken down by zip code because most people know their zip code, right? So we have Zone A, Zone B, and Zone C. So Zone A will be evacuated for maybe a Category 1 or 2 hurricane, while the farther inland locations in Zone C might not be evacuated unless it's a 3, 4, or a 5. Here's what you need to know. We, the news, will pass along to you the directions that come from the mayor, the county judge. If you're not watching us from Texas, we have county judges in Texas. If you're watching us from Louisiana, you have your parish president, right? If you're watching us from maybe from Florida, you've got your mayor, you've got your county commissioner, and you've got the governor and all that stuff. There will be zones for which an evacuation is issued, depending on state. Most of the time, even if it's a mandatory evacuation, they're not going to come into your house and drag you out in handcuffs. But what the officials will say is, if you choose to stay behind, you're doing so at your own risk and we're not going to be able to come rescue you. So if you're asked to evacuate, the good idea is to do it. If you want to know if you're in an evacuation zone, my best advice is to Google it. If you live in our local area here in Houston, you can go to our fox26houston.com, go to the Tropical tab, and there will be a PDF file that you can print out that's called the Hurricane Toolbox. And that will have information on how to contact your local emergency management. Okay, so what should you do if you're asked to evacuate? Well, first of all, you should have a plan ahead of time. The plan ahead of time is, if you're asked to evacuate, where are you going to go? If you have pets, is the place you're going to accept pets? If it's a public shelter, probably not. So you may have to find friends, family, or a hotel that accepts pets. If you're going to leave, make sure somebody knows where you're going. Make sure that many people know where you are going, so that if, God forbid, the storm is really a catastrophe, they know where you are. And if you can't contact them, they say, oh, they're okay, they're in Katy, they're in Austin, so they're okay. Secure your home. Bring in anything that you're worried about people messing with. Make sure that even if you're evacuating in your car, that you have a supply of water and food, medicine, and maybe even a first aid kit. You know why? And this is the last thing we're going to be able to talk about today, and we'll continue this next week. Hurricane Rita, many, many, many more people died during the evacuation than from the actual storm. Hurricane Rita was a disaster. And a lot of it happened because people got stuck on the roads. And I think if we had folks that had ice water and thermoses filled with ice and food and things like that, we might have fared a little bit better. So something to keep in mind if you are asked to evacuate. If you all like this, please let me know. If you're watching on YouTube and you found it informative or interesting or useful, hit the thumbs up button, give me a comment, so that way I know if I should continue doing these, because I've got stacks and stacks and stacks of frequently asked questions that I want to make sure that you know about. Thanks for joining me today for Mondays with Mike, which airs each Monday on Fox Local at 1 p.m. and then is posted on YouTube. Shout out to my mom and Neil in Florida, where I'm sure you all are getting ready for hurricane season as well. And happy belated birthday again to Mom. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.